At the end of February 1943, the National Socialist regime in Germany faced disaster. In the east, the entire German 6th Army had been defeated at Stalingrad, and the front had collapsed as nearly all of the gains of the previous year were lost in a few short weeks. In North Africa, it was clear that the end was near as Axis forces held on to a bridgehead in Tunisia which could only be supplied at great difficulty and great cost. Meanwhile, Hitler's Italian ally Mussolini was now openly talking of a peace deal. It was at this time, towards the end of a cold winter, that resistance happened at home, in the very centre of Berlin. This was the Rosenstrasse protest, and its aim was to save the lives of Jewish family members of non-Jewish people. Much has been said about the Rosenstrasse protest, and much of this is legend and, unfortunately, untrue. Here, in this video, I'll tell you what really happened and give you some analysis. By the end of September 1942, there were still some 75,800 Jewish people working in the armaments and related industries in Germany. On the 22nd of September 1942, Hitler, whose empire by then reached its furthest extent, and possibly considering that these people were no longer required in what may have seemed to him as though victory was at hand, urged that they be replaced by other forced labourers. As a result, this order was sent to the Reich Security Main Office, RSHA, which arranged several transports to Riga and the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. However, within weeks, the situation at the fronts changed dramatically. Despite there having been a transport crisis during the previous winter, a new crisis hit once more as soon as the cold arrived. In view of this, the deportations were discontinued in December, but the companies which profited from this forced labour were informed that the Jewish people would be evacuated by the end of March 1943 at the latest. By this time, there were around 20,400 Jewish people left in the armaments and related industries. One of the major points of the Wannsee Conference of the 20th of January 1942 had been the subject of who was to be considered Jewish and who was not. 13 months later, on the 20th of February 1943, Department 4B4 of the Reich Security Main Office, in which Adolf Eichmann worked, gave more detailed instructions for the technical implementation of the evacuation of Jews to the east. According to this, certain groups of Jews were to be exempted from deportation for the time being, and this included Jewish partners from mixed marriages and, under certain circumstances, the divorced partner of the mixed marriage, married Jews who lived with non-Jewish relatives, Jews over the age of 65 unless they were married to a Jew under the age of 65, holders of certain medals and awards, and those persons who had some form of deferment issued by the RSHA. Although these groups were not to be deported for the time being, they were no longer to be employed in armaments factories, but were to be used elsewhere as forced labourers. This meant that they could be called up any time to be deported. The advantage of this for the Nazis was that no objections would be put up by the factory management, which resented having its staff taken away. Given the catastrophic situation at the front at the time, what this shows is that killing the Jews took precedence over winning the war. This happened after Stalingrad, but just before Goebbels' total war speech, which in my opinion makes a total mockery of that speech. On the 26th of February 1943, Jews in several cities were asked to report to the Gestapo the next day to check their working papers. However, here in Breslau, today Wrocław in Poland, where a large number of Jews lived, the victims were arrested without warning in their homes or factories in the early morning of the 27th of February and detained on the grounds of the synagogue. In Dresden, the so-called Helleberg Jewish camp was converted into a collection camp. In Berlin, however, the raid could not be carried out so quickly due to the amount of people to be rounded up. Furthermore, the raids were not coordinated with the transport authorities, and thus no date of evacuation had been given. On the morning of the 27th of February 1943, the Gestapo and SS abruptly sealed off about 100 factories and transported those arrested on open trucks to prepared assembly points, with no consideration whatsoever for the damage that this would do to weapons production. Other Jews, who were identified by the Jewish star, were arrested by the police in the street. Later, the Gestapo searched apartments and took away the Jewish residents. In total, about 11,000 Jews were imprisoned in this large-scale raid in Berlin. Some people were able to escape the roundup by being warned at the factories of what was about to happen, or whilst it was happening, and escape was assisted by non-Jewish staff and in one case by a policeman. However, cases of escape were unusual due to the surprise created by the fast action of the authorities. This is the monument that stands today where the Lewitzowstrasse synagogue once was. This had been used as a place for gathering people due to be deported in the past and was used again now. Other locations where people were collected included the Concert House Klo in the Mauerstrasse in the district of Mitte, a vehicle hall of the Hermann Göring barracks in Wedding, horse stables of the Rathenau barracks in the Feldzeugmeisterstrasse in Moabit, and the Jewish retirement home on Große Hamburger Strasse in the Mitte district. Another location was here, the building of the Jewish community in Rosenstrasse near Alexanderplatz in the centre of Berlin, where up to 2,000 people were brought. It would appear that the Gestapo had been at pains to bring all those prisoners living in mixed marriages, as well as partially Jewish people here, where their cases were to be examined. However, word got out and relatives of the detainees gathered in front of the building at Rosenstrasse demanding that the prisoners be released. The crowd grew in size and reached several hundred people, with people protesting in shifts. The police repeatedly asked the women to leave the street and manhandle them, but no sooner had the police cleared the protesters away that they hid in side streets and came back as soon as the police were gone. It's not clear if firearms were threatened, but of course in the National Socialist dictatorship there was always this risk, which must have been on the minds of the protesters. There was a very real risk also of being arrested and sent to a concentration camp. However, some prisoners did begin to trickle out of the building. As from the 2nd of March 1943, some Jews from mixed marriages and exceptional cases were released. It seems as though nearly all of the 2,000 people at Rosenstrasse were released after their details had been checked in a time-consuming process and their status was beyond doubt. This procedure corresponded to a written instruction of the Reich Security Main Office of the 20th of February 1943. On the 5th of March 1943, 25 of the Rosenstrasse prisoners were deported to the Auschwitz III Monowitz concentration camp. This camp had no mass murder facilities, those being at the base camp and at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The prisoners here were to be used for slave labour in the manufacture of synthetic rubber. Very unusually, this group was brought back and released after a few weeks. Apparently, overzealous Gestapo officials had not complied with the guidelines of the Reich Security Main Office, according to which certain groups should be spared from deportation. Those released from custody in Rosenstrasse had to report to the Employment Office and were obliged to do forced labour. Many were assigned work with the Reich Association of Jews in Germany and its institutions. There they replaced fully Jewish workers who had been deported to their deaths. Whereas those at Rosenstrasse were released, this was not the case with those in other collection points. Here there were no protests, possibly as there was no one left to protest on behalf of those arrested. Despite the problems at the front and lack of supplies, National Socialist authorities found the capacity to arrange for 5 transports to Auschwitz between the 1st of March 1943 and the 6th of March 1943. On the 9th of March 1943, the fully Jewish employees of the Reich Association of Jews in Germany, who had been deferred until then, were arrested with their relatives and deported to Auschwitz on the 12th of March 1943. Another transport with people of mixed race left Berlin on the 17th of March 1943 for Theresienstadt. After a stay in this camp, most of these people probably ended up in Auschwitz, where they were murdered. The fate of those who arrived in Auschwitz was mainly death. For example, the Auschwitz archive has the following document. Transport from Berlin, arrival 5th of March 1943, total strength 1,128 Jews, 389 men sent to Auschwitz-Monowitz, Buna, and 96 women were assigned to work. Special treatment was given to 151 men and 492 women and children. Transport from Berlin, arrival 7th of March 1943, total strength 690. Special treatment was given to 30 men and 417 women and children. Signed Schwarz, Obersturmführer. Special treatment means gassing. Joseph Goebbels, the Gauleiter of Berlin, was not happy that so many people were reprieved. On the 2nd of March 1943, he wrote in his diary, "Unfortunately, it turned out that the better circles, especially the intellectuals, do not understand our policy towards the Jews and in some cases take the side of the Jews. As a result, our action has been betrayed prematurely, so that a crowd of Jews have been wiped through our hands, but we'll still get hold of them." On the 6th of March 1943, he wrote, "Right now, after the heavy destruction from the bombing raids, the SD considers it advisable to continue with the evacuation of Jews. Unfortunately, somewhat unpleasant scenes took place in the front of a Jewish retirement home where the population gathered in large numbers and some even sided with the Jews. I instruct the SD not to continue the evacuation of the Jews at such a critical time. We'd rather save that for a few more weeks, then we can do it all the more thoroughly." It would appear that the assumption that Goebbels had the action stopped because of the protest is based on this source. In fact, on the contrary, it was accelerated according to the original instructions. On the 11th of March 1943, Goebbels only objected to the premature arrest of Jews from privileged mixed marriages. He wrote then, "The evacuation of the Jews from Berlin led to some misunderstandings. Unfortunately, the Jews from privileged marriages were also arrested first, which led to great fear and confusion." For most, released at Rosenstrasse was no more than a temporary reprieve. There were probably no more than 1,500 Jewish people by then surviving underground in Berlin when the Red Army arrived. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you found that interesting. I upload videos every Friday at 2000 hours and sometimes at other times as well. If you'd like to know when I'm uploading at other times as well, then you will want to subscribe perhaps. My specialist area is in the Holocaust, although there's also material related to other times in history, particularly the Second World War, the Nazi period and communist period, and recently I've done a fair amount on the war in Ukraine. Thanks for being with me. Regards from Germany.